So Dan, I mean, what were your biggest takeaways from the players that they ended up picking?
Yeah, so I went through all the squads in my pre-auction thread on Twitter. I don't know if you've seen that. Anyone's seen that? That's on my Twitter timeline at SA Advantage, and there were several main areas where I think that Mumbai really needed to strengthen compared to last season. So last season, their middle overs bowling, particularly spin, was a real issue. They kind of had to make do with domestic players who perhaps weren't premium quality, and they sort of chopped and changed a little bit. So having a premium wrist spinner really was, for me, something that they really need to look at in this auction. But they didn't do it, basically. And now it's difficult really to see. Their spin options are still very, very thin on the ground. I thought they would have gone for like an Adil Rashid or Adam Zampa or something, someone, or even a Rayhan Ahmed, some either premium quality spinner or a spinner with potential, and they didn't do that. So for me, this MI squad now still has a big hole in it in that respect. They decided to blow their budget instead on Cameron Green, who, look, he's a player of high potential. Do I think he's good player? Yes. Do I think he has high potential? Yes. Do I think he's overpriced? Also, yes. And do I think that MI should have spent their money on perhaps some different skill sets? Also, yes, as well. So I also think that the history books will not judge this purchase particularly well, and it wouldn't be surprised for me, at least, if he was released in a year's time. The other key area I think that they needed to look at was a backup for Jofra Archer, given the fact that we're really not sure how fit he might be, and I think they achieved that with a Jai Richardson, very much a sort of like for like type player. Really can hit down the order, can bowl in multiple phases. For me, that made a lot of sense, that purchase, and I think that was a lot more astute than the Cameron Green one.
So, I mean, Dan, first things first. Do you think MI have spent 17 crores on a player that might not even be in their best 11, or at least the starting 11?
Or if he makes to the starting 11, who do you leave out? Because I think the last game that they played, they had Brevis, Stubbs, and Tim David in the 11. So
Yeah.
I don't see how all three of them play if Green plays. So who do you leave out?
Well, you have to leave out one of those three batters because they're going to pick either Archer or a replacement in, say, Jai Richardson or one of the other pacers that they've got from the overseas market as their four overseas, aren't they? So it's got to be one of David or the two South African guys who get dropped if Green plays. And if Green doesn't play, they don't really have an abundance of all-rounders either. So it's kind of looks a really tricky balance to get a nice looking sort of well-rounded team, if you like. So then that's the other thing as well, because if you do play Green, there's a good chance that they're going to bat him at 7, and that's kind of not really where he's done well for Australia either. He's done well opening, and I can't see MI moving away from the Rohit Sharma Ishan Kishan opening partnership, and so kind of. There's someone that I know on Twitter, Jack Hope. He posted and he said that Mumbai are a team of 11 ones rather than one team of 11, and I think that makes a lot of sense actually in terms of just a lot of individuals. But I don't think the sum of the parts is going to be this as much as the individuals if you added them all together. If that makes sense.
Yeah, the way I see it is, I mean, they've spent so much on a player. Now, after spending so much, they'll be bound to try and fit him in the 11. If they do it, like you said, even if they leave out one of the two South Africans, that means that they have only one. They can use only one more overseas spot for a bowler, assuming that Green plays, Brevis plays, David plays, and Archer plays. So and they do not have a lot of Indian backups in the bowling options as well. So that again leaves the room. They were already the worst bowling side in last year's tournament.
Yeah.
I if I can come in here, I actually think that they 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 will have to go back to their strategy of playing two overseas bowlers like they did in 2019 and 2021 when they actually won two titles, because
Yeah,
they don't have any other, proven, or they might have potential pace bowlers, but they don't have anyone proven at this level or with experience at this level. I was very
mm,
surprised that they did not bid for the likes of Sandeep Sharma, or they did not even try and go for someone like Ishan Porel. So I,
yeah,
I, I just feel that a lot of their success is going to hinge on Bumrah's and Surya Kumar Yadav's shoulders, because outside of that, uh, everything, because I don't think they're going to drop Tim David. I think both Brevis and Stubbs might miss out of the 11. And
yeah,
the bigger issue that I see here is that MI could get stuck in the cost of sunk fallacy with someone like Cameron Green, because IPL teams have tended to do that. They sometimes put out the most expensive 11 on the park, and not the most suitable or most balanced 11. So I want to know this from Dan, that how often and how real is this possibility, because you have now worked with the IPL team. Do you think that sometimes teams can actually go and put out the most expensive 11 on the park rather than the most balanced one?
I mean, I wasn't really privy to team selection at PBKs, but what I will say is that I think that that's a definite possibility from the mentality of team management, and also from kind of, if you're looking to manage upwards as well, then if you're a head coach, you're going to achieve a lot less criticism if you play the most expensive 11. If you, in terms of the conversations that you might have with the owners, if you've spent a fortune on someone that you've made a massive case for before the auction to the owners, and then you don't pick him, then it's going to make you look like you don't know what you're doing, or you're in a difficult spot. So yeah, I think there is that potential to really pick players um, on price rather than ability, or how they might fit into the best balanced 11. Definitely, and I think that this is a big problem in terms of like the auction format, if you like, which we don't necessarily have in a draft format, where like if you're picking someone and maybe they're like one or two bands, salary bands higher than someone else, there's not really like that pressure to pick them in, let's say, the 100 that there might be in the IPL, where like a Cameron Green might be 10 or 20 times more expensive than someone else, like a Joe Richardson, for example.
mm. We're getting a lot of questions on Rohit and Dan. This is a topic that you have touched upon a lot of times in the past. Maybe, just maybe, I mean, we don't know. We know over the course of when the tournament begins. Have they bought Cameron Green with an eye towards the future? That I mean, Rohit is near to his career's end rather than a start. So at some point of time, he'll have to move on, and there will be a vacancy up top. So probably they are looking at Green from that lens. And even if they are, is Green the right uh, person for that job? And is the amount of money that they've shelled out
Mm.
reflective of that?
Yeah, so first of all, I think Green is a risk, really. I mean, we've only seen him play a few times at a high level for Australia at the top of the order. I still think his bowling is going to be tested at this high level as well, in terms of his T20 skills. Yes, he's done well in Test cricket recently, but I think this is a whole different ball game. We haven't seen a lot of him in his own domestic competition, so it's a gamble at the end of the day. It's a huge gamble for big money. Yes, the high reward is potentially there, but it's also a very high risk, and I prefer low risk, high reward rather than high risk, high reward. And as far as that long term replacement for Rohit Sharma, no, I don't think that they bought him specifically with that in mind. I just think that they wanted him as the player, and they'll just shoehorn him in some way, shape, or form. Um, but I think MI would do well to look at that long term replacement for Rohit Sharma, because his performance levels are not getting any better. He's not getting any younger. Something I've talked about a lot is they're going to have to work out how they're going to manage this transition away from Rohit Sharma before it costs them too much. Has that point already happened? Quite possibly, in terms of the time where it's going to start costing them. they've kind of maybe swerved that decision-making process so far, but they can't carry on doing that forever. And I think this is something that the IPL teams really struggle with, and as much as international teams as well, some perhaps to a greater extent, IPL teams struggle with this. Is that this moving away from the legends of the past, if that makes sense? And it's
Yeah,
very, very
this takes me back to one of the mythbusters that we had done on this episode, where you actually spoken of how experience sometimes can be uh, overrated in terms of this format. Now, I have two questions to ask you. One is, uh, do you think MI can afford another bad season? Because last season, what we saw was that they had spent eight crores on Jofra, they had spent 3 crores on someone like Brevis, and teams rarely spend that much on an under 19 cricketer. And then they had, then they also got Stubbs. uh, do you think, last season we could say that MI was probably banking on a few potential picks, and hoping that they'll give the reward in the next cycle, and maybe they can afford to spend 8 crores on a player who's not going to be even available for that season? Do you, and now it's been 2 seasons that they haven't qualified for the playoffs. uh, One, do you see them qualify this season? Two, if they don't, do you think, it's going to lead to changes? Because I don't think it has ever happened before that MI has not qualified for playoffs for 3 seasons in a row. They did not qualify for the first 2 seasons, but the third season they actually finished on top of the table. It's And they lost out in the finals. But do you think it could be the first time that MI won't qualify for 3 seasons in a row?
Yeah, I think that's definitely possible. But there's certainly no guarantees that they're gonna end up in the top four. Obviously, now we know we've seen with the addition of two extra teams, it's that much harder to qualify in the top four now. 4 from 10 rather than 4 from 8. So we're looking at 40% of teams qualifying rather than 50. So that makes it tougher for them. Look, they've also had this management change with Jay Warden sort of stepping aside as head coach, but taking a more sort of directorial role. Look, for me, I think it's all to do with recruitment and that long-term strategy. And you can't win a tournament at an auction, but you can go a long way to losing a tournament at an auction. And I felt that their performance in the mega auction in February was really quite curious. And I felt again that they were sort of they didn't maybe the early rounds didn't go for them, and then they had to sort of adapt a little bit. But I felt that they didn't really have a coherent plan that was going to work for them, basically.
Mm.
Do you think?
Yeah,
Okay,
no,
we'll
Gurkirat,
take
go ahead. Yeah.
Sahil's question first. We'll take Sahil questions first, and then we'll come back to the question that I have, and then we'll move on to the next team.
So Sahil says, why are teams hoarding talent? MI have David, Stubbs, Brevis, LSG have 3 wicketkeeper batsmen. Is it a part of a strategy or purely coincidental?
Look, I think that's where perhaps sometimes teams are picking up players because they value the player rather than the skill set. So for me, a key part of recruitment is no matter whether it's in the IPL or county cricket or the 100 or whoever you're recruiting for, you have to find a pathway for that player to get into the starting 11. And you don't always see that. So for example, like CSK for quite a few years had Saikishore, but he was never going to play ahead of Jadeja. So it's also the team's responsibility to work out how they're going to get that player game time as well. Otherwise, it's just a waste of a roster position. It's a waste of money, and it's a waste of that player's talent as well. So, look, MI have Tim David, they have Tristan Stubbs, they have Dwyer Brevis, but I think they're going to be likely to play at least 2 out of 3. So it's reasonable for them to have those 3 because at most one of them is probably going to be cover, and you can understand it from that perspective. It's when players are hoarded and they don't, especially young players, and they don't get the opportunity, and they would probably start for another franchise instead. That's when I think it's more sad.
One last question before we move on to the next team. Dan, do you think that the impact player rule can help MI in some way or the other? Do you think they have enough Indian talent to make use of it?
So the curveball just before the auction was the announcement that unless you're not playing your full quota of overseas players, the impact player is going to have to be a domestic player. And I think that it's going to be fascinating to see who adapts quickly to these impact rules. So the only time the only league we've ever seen these type of things in is the Big Bash, and not just talk about the impact sub or what I think they called it. I don't know I can't remember what they called it in the Big Bash, but they also had like the Bash Boost, which was whichever team had the most runs after 10 overs got an extra point, and stuff like floating power play as well. What I found was that in the Big Bash, teams didn't adapt very quickly to these new rules, and they left a lot of competitive advantage on the table. So it'll be fascinating to see which IPL teams actually do adapt quicker and take advantage of the other teams' disorganisation. Now, for me, this goes back to someone spoke about Sandeep Sharma earlier. This is kind of like a bit of a surprise as to why he went on sole, really, because I think a power play specialist is one of the areas where you can see an impact sub having some difference in terms of, okay, you get maybe 3 overs out of them up top, then you get them off for a death bowler or a batter or something like that. Like that's where you can get a lot of flexibility. But on the whole, I do expect kind of phase specialists or skill set specialists. Like a intent merchant. Like you can see like someone like Abdul Samad being a really interesting impact player for Sunrisers, for example, because you've got this guy who's going to tee off from ball 1, and maybe he might not always feature in a starting 11, but he's a great option to bring off the bench if they really need quick runs. So I'm fascinated to see how this is going to play out, to be honest with you. I think it's a really good rule, and I'm generally more in favour of innovation in this kind of respect than kind of keeping the status quo as it is.
So Basta Parida from our team at cricket.com did an interview with Sandeep Sharma as well, and it's on our app and website. So guys watching us, do check that out. Dan, since we have touched the topic of impact player, before we move on to the next team, I just have one question. As an analyst, how would you approach it? Do you think of it as a 12-member team now, or do you think that play your best 11 and use the impact substitution rule only in case of an emergency?
Yeah, and this is such an interest. This is why I can't wait to see how this plays out in reality. What I would do is I would probably pick my best 11 suited for the venue, the conditions, the opposition, etc. And then you have 4 players of various skill sets on the bench who can take advantage of depending on how the game develops. If you lose 3 wickets in a power play, you might want to bring another batter in. If you're, I don't know, really up against it with 6 overs to go with the bat, you need like maybe 85 off the last 6 overs. You bring in the intent merchant, like stuff like that. These things are just absolutely fascinating. But for me, it's clear that these players have got to be either phase specialists or point of difference players. It's no good really, having like I don't know, plucking a name out of the air like a Manish Pandey or something on the bench, because it doesn't really change the dynamic of the match. It's got to be someone who can have like a short-term influence in the match, if that makes sense.